As chair of Larkin 100, it was always my intention to ensure that something was happening in every place associated with Larkin at some point during this centenary year. Belfast was always top of my list, and so I was thrilled when I was invited to give a talk at this year's Belfast International Arts Festival. Sadly, because of illness, I was unable to complete the talk, so I thought I'd put together this video which covers what I'd intended to say. I first came to Belfast in 2013 on a kind of pilgrimage to seek out as much as I could of Philip Larkin's life here, based on what I'd read about it, and through the conversations I'd had with someone who had closely shared parts of Larkin's life in Belfast. That person was the late Winifred Dawson, or Winifred Arnott as she was when Larkin first met her in October 1950. Wyn had a very special place in Larkin's story and will figure quite strongly in this talk. Wyn was one of those people who felt that the coverage and recognition of Larkin's time in Belfast had been badly neglected, not so much by the biographers, although she had plenty to say about them and what she felt they'd got wrong, particularly about her relationship with Philip, but in the media interest that followed the publication of the first biography and the selected letters. None of the major television documentaries about Larkin, for example, chose to include any coverage of his time in Belfast. I hope that this will be a small gesture towards putting that right. And so this is a talk about Philip Larkin's experiences in Belfast during the 5 years or so he lived in the city, what the place meant to him, what's important about his time here. I think it's fair to say that without Belfast, the Larkin whose poems still resonate with us in his centenary year would not have come about. Wherever possible, I want to draw also on the first-hand experience, particularly those whose lives interacted with Larkin here in Belfast, alongside Larkin's own accounts and documentation. Although I'm going to be talking mainly about the man and his life, I want also to let some of the poetry in, because this is what I think we should be really celebrating in this centenary year. I also want to say that I'm well aware that I come here as something of an outsider. I don't make any claims to know Belfast from the inside. This is the perspective of someone born in Coventry, like Larkin was, and ending up, like Larkin did, in East Yorkshire. Coming to Belfast unleashed a new poetic voice in Philip Larkin, one that would find its inspiration much more directly from the day-to-day experiences of the world he inhabited, and one which still resonates today, perhaps for that reason. It will, I hope, shine a beacon on what I have to say. So why did Larkin come to Belfast? Well, the title of this talk gives us a strong clue. Larkin came here precisely because to him it was elsewhere, a place away from home, a place to escape to and start a new life in. In 1950, Larkin was living in Leicester, in a house shared with his widowed mother and working as a sub-librarian at University College Leicester. His life was in turmoil. Faced with a mother who was profoundly unhappy and increasingly depressed after the death of her husband Sidney in 1948, he also found himself entangled in relationships. A fiancée twice over in the form of Ruth Bowman, who he'd first met as a 16-year-old schoolgirl in Wellington in Shropshire, and an increasingly demanding relationship with Monica Jones, a lecturer in English at Leicester. We get a flavour of Larkin's increasing desperation in the letters he wrote to his friend Jim Sutton. In May 1950 he wrote, "My chief handicap at present is this bloody set-up. Christ knows how it will end. But it can only be broken up by a good excuse like a new job. I'm not tough enough to break it up just because I want to. And I do realise that my mother must live with someone, only I'd prefer it not to be me. I'm living only half a life here. The last 5 years have been fearful, really. I felt nothing at all. Now I feel if I could get away, a sort of life might result and writing get going again." The stalling of Larkin's literary output, he'd been trying unsuccessfully to write a third novel, was undoubtedly a driving force in itself, perhaps ultimately a selfish one, as he himself acknowledged. And so finally, after a couple of failed attempts to get jobs in England, Larkin succeeded in obtaining the post of sub-librarian at Queen's University Belfast, a post he took up in October 1950. Belfast was in so many ways elsewhere to Larkin. He'd never set foot in Ireland before and had no grounding in its cultural or literary heritage. It was a place with no memories or associations. And perhaps most important of all, it was an ocean, or at least an Irish sea, away from home. And of course home couldn't be further from the sea. He might also have thought and hoped that he would be arriving with no baggage, leaving behind all his entanglements. As we shall see, this didn't prove to be the case. In fact, he was about to accumulate even more. But for a short time at least, he was about to enter the happiest and most creatively productive period of his entire life. Belfast is an unattractive city. Oh dear, oh dear. This was Larkin's first impression of the city of Belfast, sent on a postcard to his mother on Sunday, the 4th of June 1950. He was over here to be interviewed for the post of sub-librarian at Queen's, and this was to be the very first description he would give of the landscape he found himself in. Not a very promising one. He told his mother that he was feeling like a mouse set down on a bus station. Wish you were here to be frightened too. Would I were back at Dixon Drive and all well. This is so typically Larkin-esque. Any new place he went to would disturb him in its difference and tended to generate an initial negative response that would, in time, be tempered by more positive feelings of pleasure and enjoyment. This transfer of feelings would come in time in Belfast. But perhaps in this case, as Andrew Motion suggests, there was another reason for this initial display of negativity. He was already tempering his views for his mother's sake, not wanting her to think that he wouldn't miss her or would be quick to get away. In any case, of course, he got the job. He claimed 3 other candidates defected, and the world changed. And so Larkin left Leicester for Belfast on Saturday the 30th of September 1950, after spending a night in Leicester with Monica, and clutching a piece of lucky heather given to him by his mother. He'd crossed by the night boat from Liverpool, which was the usual way to travel in those days, of course. In his first letter from Belfast, written the next day, he described the journey for his mother. We sailed, that's the royal phrase, I hadn't anyone with me, on the Ulster Duke in good time. I ate some hyoscine tablets and some fish and chips, and sat on the deck in my duffel coat, writing up my diary as we edged out of the complicated docks. It takes a full hour to leave Liverpool, I timed it. Felt rather mournful as I saw we had cast off, but a spell at my diary cheered me up, and I went to bed about 10:45 in a nice single cabin. There was a little velvet convexity in the wall, circular, with a hook above it. I couldn't think what it was for a moment. Then I realised it was for a watch to hang on. It's fascinating how many times Larkin's descriptive content in a letter, especially to his mother, later transforms itself into poetry. In this case, the diary entry he refers to included the beginnings of a poem that would remain unfinished. Significantly, he titled it Single to Belfast. In this initial draft, Larkin sets out the premises of this new chapter in his life, this fully rehearsed departure, as he describes it. As the boat leaves Liverpool, slowly moving down a lane of tame water, Larkin experiences a profound shift of time. The present is really stiffening to past, right under my eyes, and my life committing itself to the long bend that swings me this Saturday night away from my midland emollient valley, away from the lack of questions, away from endearments. Not for the first time he sees himself as a voyager, whose world has boiled down to a birth, a bay, a meal, a watch hung up to glow in the dark, voices, the gravitational drag of loneliness. Whereas others may be travelling from known to known, the narrator is on a voyage to unknown, from lost. The town smells of horse dung. Belfast led Larkin by the nose. He sniffed it out. It wouldn't be the last time a place would impact on him in this way. 5 years later, when arriving in Hull, he would tell his mother that it was rather chilly here and smells of fish. In both cases, these descriptions contain a literal truth, intended as a negative but later to return in more positive poetic expression. Hull would be transformed poetically into a fishy-smelling pastoral of ships up streets, and Belfast, in the importance of elsewhere, into a three-dimensional landscape of draughty streets, end-on to hills, and a faint, archaic smell of docklands, like a stable. Larkin's early descriptions show a feeling of an almost instant engagement with his surroundings, and a positivity of spirit that would increase further in time. A walk into Belfast finds, quote, a wide and cobbled-streeted town lined with frowning buildings in the late Victorian manner and some indifferent shops. Later he walks down among the straight, wide, black, glistening, lamp-hung, tram-line bisected main streets. Policemen in caps, trolleybuses taking their last loads. Might have been anywhere really, says Larkin. Leicester, Nottingham, Birmingham. He would begin to explore the countryside around Belfast at weekends, cycling along Belfast Lough to Carrickfergus. The weather was cloudy and windy, he told his mother, and I sat on a seat on the esplanade, trying not to shiver and watching the little waves slapping the pebble beaches. I found a dirty-looking cafe and had some fish and chips for tea, then pedalled home. The way back was nicer, though the wind was against me. The sun had come out, and the sky over the loch was very shifting and full of pretty clouds, while on the landward side the hills were a dark green. He sent his mother photographs of Queen's University campus, comparing it to his old school in Coventry, particularly the frontage we see here. And indeed, as a Coventrian myself, I can see the resemblance. The truth is, Belfast suited Larkin from day one. He found himself in a university far larger and more prestigious than the one he'd just left, one which had more than an echo of his days as an Oxford undergraduate. But now he possessed the added confidence and maturity gained from his experiences in both Wellington, where he'd begun his career as a public librarian, and Leicester. Larkin's first accommodation was in Queen's Chambers, a hostel for unmarried male members of staff and senior students. In its collegiate atmosphere, he soon established a group of friends, chiefly from the lecturing staff, and relished a kind of lifestyle not experienced since leaving Oxford in 1943. A fresh level of independence, of freedom to choose, albeit within a patterned timetable, where rooms were cleaned, meals served in a student dining hall, and perhaps most importantly, no mother to come home to and keep company, and nights free to be spent in the company of others, with no relationship obligations. In pubs or jazz clubs, or simply in each other's rooms playing cards, drinking and smoking until the early hours. The majority of the new friends Larkin would make in Belfast would also be outsiders from other parts of the British Isles, who formed what James Booth, Larkin's latest biographer, called a cultural island in the college amid surrounding sectarianism. The names are littered liberally through the letters written to his mother and to Monica Jones. J.C. Beckett, then the warden in Queen's Chambers, later to become a professor of Irish history here at Queen's. Alan Graham, Evan John, who would eventually turn up as a character in Lucky Jim, and Dennis Bradley, who Larkin described as being very tall, my ears come up to his shoulders. And then there was Arthur Terry, a lecturer in Spanish, who Larkin would become especially friendly with in the years to come, and with whom he shared a literary affinity as well as a great interest in jazz. And so Larkin, with a perceptible if qualified sense of relish, was soon busily forming a new life with a new set of, for the most part, enjoyable rhythms and routines. And it kept him in good humour too. "There's a chap on the staff called Fear," he told Monica. "I'm longing to depart one day, saying I have an appointment with him." Not that the company always suited him. In fact, there were some early signs of an inner tension within him, something he hadn't left behind on the shoreline of Liverpool. "Yesterday, Graham, Bradley and a man called Terry and I walked to Lisbon, some 7 or 8 miles, I suppose, and Bradley and I stayed there for the evening," he told his mother. "This was all right, but I do get bored so easily. A few hours of anyone is always enough for me. Then I long for a book and my own interrupted thought. Regarding my new life, it is superficially quite bearable, but at bottom, all lives are impossible. I don't mean I'm not quite happy, but it doesn't do to analyse it all." Was this for his mother's benefit again, not wanting to appear to be too happy, too settled? Or was it symptomatic of some deeper issue within Larkin? Perhaps in truth, a bit of both. The fear of being engulfed, assimilated into a social milieu, and of wanting to remain, in part at least, an outsider, was a very real one for Larkin. Above all this, the wish to be alone. That famous line from the poem Once, a poem that Larkin had started in Leicester and finished in Belfast, reflected tension already within him. Here in Belfast, its sentiments would be heightened dramatically. Part of him wished to remain an outsider, to feel not entirely at home. According to another of his biographers, Richard Bradford, this would serve as a positive tension that empowered his writing. Larkin, says Bradford, relished the tensions of being at once part of and different from this new environment, and this in turn provided a greater impulse to his output as a poet. He now felt, says Bradford, more confident as an outsider, someone who could commit his impressions and imaginings to the word on the page without becoming their captive. Of course, what enabled Larkin to come to Belfast was work, and he came to a library position that marked a considerable step up in responsibility. This was something that both pleased and worried him in equal measure. Here's Larkin's own account of his experience in the library. It was, of course, the old library, first opened in 1865 and built along ecclesiastical lines. The building had its challenges, as Larkin was soon to find out. No one had much of an idea of what a library ought to be like in those days. I'd just left one that had started life as a lunatic asylum, and the ecclesiastical atmosphere didn't bother me. The light was dim and religious. The lofty pitched roof of the reading room magnified the clack of rulers and tapping of heels, but seemed to absorb conversation. The stack was claustrophobic and even creepy. The galleries had a reputation for romantic assignation. I had no room, but was given a desk from which I could see most of what was happening at the issue desk and throughout most of the reading room. As I was now in charge of what would now be called reader services, this was appropriate. But it had its drawbacks. One day I woke up at my desk surrounded by a group of students I was to show round the stack. They were not exactly giggling, but they were amused. When the building was reorganised and redesigned, Larkin did get a room and a telephone. Something, he said, in some indefinable way improved my status. Larkin was always rooms conscious. He once turned down a post at Reading University because the desk and the room was not large enough. He boasted that his desk in Hull was bigger than President Kennedy's. Larkin found the job more challenging than in Leicester. He told his mother that he was not good at keeping order and discipline, but it was clear that his work was much appreciated by his boss, Jack Granique, and there was a mutual sense of admiration. "Granique is extremely nice without being at all my kind of man," he told Monica. "He is a pusher, mover, a coherer, an urger, a carer. I am a learner, a shopper, an analyst, a discourager, a scoffer. Nevertheless, he is extremely nice, and I can't imagine him in a temper. So what was Larkin like at this time? How did he really come across? Records show that he was popular among the 14 or so mainly female, mainly young staff he worked with in the library. They saw him as an efficient and conscientious librarian, at the same time friendly and approachable and good fun. Wynne Dawson gives the fullest account. Forget the later picture of the heavily jowled, bald librarian in his respectable dark suit and owlish glasses. Well, yes, he was already balding at 28, but was still slim and very tall, and more than that, he dressed in clothes which were never seen in Belfast. Patterned sports jackets, coloured trousers, plain pink shirts, white bow ties, sandals, not necessarily all at once. It made him seem different, exciting, pointed to a future world waiting to be explored. Then there was his stammer, which, though genuine, gave an added frisson to the outrageous things he said. Most delightful of all were his famous faces, immortalised by Kingsley Amis in Lucky Jim. Imagine working in an office where soon after work began, the door would open and a face would come round, contorted into an expression of agony or disgust, eventually followed by the rest of him, with an account of what had caused this. It seems that in Belfast, at least, Larkin came closest to the vision of the librarian he once said he would like to be. Just a nice chap to have around. Not an image of him that would be universally agreed upon, of course, by those who came across him in libraries. Having said that, I think Larkin's career and success as a librarian has generally been underplayed. He may have fallen into it almost by accident, but it was a job that suited him, that he was good at, and at the end of the day formed part of the conditions for writing, both constraining and enabling it in different ways. There is an accuracy in the later description of him given by the Vice-Chancellor of Hull University, Bryn Mawr-Jones, who introduced him to the Queen Mother as our poet librarian, and also in Seamus Heaney's far later vision of, quote, a 9-to-5 man who had seen poetry. Larkin would look back on Belfast as the ideal place to write in. In an interview for the Paris Review in 1982, he particularly singled out the top-floor flat scenario, a precursor to the flat he would later come to occupy for 17 years in Pearson Park in Hull. But it was also the social context of Belfast that made it perfect. I wrote between 8 and 10 in the evenings, then went to the university bar till 11, then played cards or talked with friends till 1 or 2. The first part of the evening had the second part to look forward to, and I could enjoy the second part with a clear conscience because I'd done my 2 hours. How much more positive that sounds than his answer to a previous question in the same interview, in which he described his present life in Hull in 1982, 3 years before his premature death. By that time he was ensconced in a large and rather characterless house in the middle-class enclave of Hull, close to the university. My life is as simple as I can make it. Work all day, cook, eat, wash up, telephone, hack writing, drink, television in the evenings. I almost never go out. I suppose everyone tries to ignore the passing of time, some people by doing a lot. Being in California one year and Japan the next. Or there's my way, making every day and every year exactly the same. Probably neither works. How sad that sounds, how far removed from these halcyon days in Belfast. It's important to remember, of course, that writing for Larkin took more than one form. The bulk of what he wrote came in the form of correspondence. He was one of the last great literary letter writers. Letters always played a significant role in Larkin's life. From his time at Oxford, when he would begin to write home regularly, until his mother's death at the age of 91, he would maintain a constancy of regular letters home, alongside other regular correspondence with friends and figures from the literary world, Kingsley Amis, Jim Sutton, Robert Conquest, Barbara Pym being some of the most important. Later on, friends made in Belfast, like Judy Edgerton, would be added to the list. I always find it astonishing that he found so much time to write, but it was a well-established routine. The Belfast Sundays, with everywhere closed, assisted him somewhat. In the early days especially, it would be a day set aside for letter writing. And letter writing served several different functions for Larkin. In themselves they formed an important outlet for creative thought and for providing a detailed commentary and a log, really, of everyday situations he encountered. This is particularly true of the letters to his mother, where in both sides of the conversation aspects of day-to-day life are so prominent. As Clive James once put it, the correspondence with his mother helped to restore the precious ordinariness that she represented, and which formed the lifeblood of his poetry. Moreover, these letters from Belfast provide brilliant socio-historical descriptions of what the city was like in the early years of the 1950s. Letters were also a form of control, a crucial way of handling relationships at a distance, especially with his mother and with Monica. They allowed Larkin to present different parts of himself to different people, and to establish personas that he thought best matched their own. Letters to Eva and to Monica, as was the case with other recipients, were written in a different register and with a difference of focus. The content was often the same but angled differently. Moreover, with a correspondent like Monica Jones, he found it easier to express emotional thoughts and feelings than he ever could in a face-to-face situation. Larkin reinvented himself on the page, or rather represented himself. Once, Monica wrote tellingly to him from Leicester in 1950, "Your letters are so unlike the person I last saw. I suppose because you are not being that person when you write." And here lay another source of tension. The anxieties, the existential dilemmas about commitment, about filial responsibility, crop up on page after page. His desire to care for his mother, but not to have her come and live in Belfast with him, was a delicately poised challenge. He needed her settled in, perhaps shared with a suitable companion, so that he could shake off his awareness and fear of her dependency on him. With Monica, another form of tension runs through letter after letter, the question of marriage and its undesirability to Larkin. But with Monica he also found the perfect outlet for his literary sensibilities. His letters to her from Belfast were intensely literary and reflected the extent to which he had found new opportunities for reading and devouring literature. John Sutherland, Monica's recent biographer, and the only person to have seen both sides of the dialogue between the two of them, said that the letters formed, quote, "a connecting filament between them." And then there was the poetry. Astonishingly, over 60 of Larkin's poems, not all of them published of course, were either written or completed in Belfast. The best of these would find their way into The Less Deceived, Larkin's first volume of mature poetry, published in 1955, soon after he left Belfast for Hull. Prior to that, and within months of his move here, Larkin found a local publisher who he asked to produce a self-funded pamphlet containing 20 of the poems he felt most confident about. I was thinking about whether or not you could describe any of them as specifically Belfast poems. He is not a location poet in that specific sense, of course, and hardly mentions place names in any of his poems. Coventry is the exception, and Oxford, but there's no mention of Hull, though the surrounding villages are named in Bridge for the Living, and there are none of Belfast, although the two cities, Hull and Belfast, are recognisable in some of the poems from their Dockland settings, as we've already seen. Apart from recognising the contours of the city and some specific detail of cultural context, a poem like March Past features that, of course. I think the Belfast poems underline the success Larkin had in obtaining what he set out to achieve when he first arrived. That is, a sense of being not here or anywhere, I think the poem Absences is my notion, therefore, of a Belfast poem, in that respect at least. Truly one of his best. Rain patters on a sea that tilts and sighs, fast running floors collapsing into hollows, tower suddenly, spray-haired, contrariwise, a wave drops like a wall, another follows, wilting and scrambling, tirelessly at play, where there are no ships and no shallows. Above the sea, the yet more shoreless day, riddled by wind, trails lit up galleries. They shift to giant ribbing, sift away. Such attics cleared of me, such absences. Larkin also found himself engaged, to some extent at least, in the local literary scene. He was invited to John Hewitt's on occasions, where he met other writers and poets, Roy McFadden, and an infamous meeting with Ian Forster. I had an interesting meeting on Friday when I had the honour of being invited to meet Ian Forster, the novelist, who was over to unveil a tablet to a local writer, Larkin told his mother in October 1952. He was very pleasant, but I found it very hard to talk to him. He gave a less gracious account of the same meeting to Monica Jones. I met old Celsol, as you call him, on the Frida. Sprawled on a sofa, an untidy, aged Billy Bunter with a toothy grin, he received us gracefully in rotation, about 10 or 15 minutes each. In my case, it was a series of gambits declined on both sides. Cambridge, gambit declined. Nature of inspiration, gambit declined. Light fantastic, gambit declined. Have you read my book? Gambit declined. And finally silence. From him, Forrest Reed, gambit declined. Are you writing? Gambit declined. Yours must be a very interesting job. Gambit double declined. And finally silence. He wore a boot on one foot and a shoe on the other. I suppose I could have done better, but I always feel about talking to famous men that it doesn't matter what you say to them, like leaving litter on Everest. John Hewitt is an interesting personal connection for me, as, like Larkin, I was born and brought up in Coventry and knew first-hand the Herbert Art Gallery that Hewitt came to be director of in 1957. Despite their obvious differences, the work of the two men sometimes appeared cheek by jowl in various publications. Hewitt's 1966 celebratory essay, commissioned by Coventry City Council's Public Relations Department to mark its reconstructed heartland, includes I Remember on its first page. Larkin would in turn include Hewitt's poem Lines from a Museum Man's Album in his Oxford Book of 20th Century Verse. Both men, of course, crossed the Irish Sea to find themselves as outsiders. Hewitt's take on this in the poem The Search provides an interesting contrast to Larkin. It is a hard responsibility to be a stranger, to hear your speech sounding at odds with your neighbours, holding your tongue from quick comparisons, remembering that you are a guest in the house. Hewitt's embracing of Coventry was different from Larkin's partial immersion in Belfast, of course, but there are clearly some overlaps, and in another place, another time, maybe it would be interesting to compare them further. Of course, in Belfast, Larkin's old life had not exactly gone away. He still had a girlfriend back in Leicester, Monica Jones, to whom he still felt a close bond, to whom he wrote long letters filled with literary content, whilst at the same time conducting an arm's-length dialogue regarding marriage. He had a mother too who still held a level of dependency over him and who could not get settled, and to whom he still felt the commitment of a dutiful son. But a new face was about to enter his life, one which would have a significant influence on his writing. This is Winifred Arnott, the English graduate from Queen's, who took up a temporary post in the library a month or so before Larkin arrived. Born in London but schooled in Northern Ireland and living with an aunt in Lisbon, she was 7 years younger than Larkin, a bright, happy and personable young woman who found herself, to quote her, enjoying the company of this slightly older man from England. Here she describes him in more detail. I'd begun work at QUB a few weeks before he arrived. as a humble cataloguer, temporarily replacing another girl who'd gone on a course. Philip's reputation preceded him, for we knew he'd written a novel and had it published. We were excited at the thought of having an author in our midst. I must admit I don't remember our first meeting, but very soon he made the strongest impression on us all. Still unforgettable. Winifred always described their relationship as a close friendship and would later take offence at the Larkin biographers like Andrew Motion, who insisted on describing it as a flirtatious one. It was a friendship, she said, built out of a certain affinity of position. Here is Wynne documenting it in a talk she once gave. Philip and I stood apart from the solid Ulster people around us, in our accents and our attitudes. Everything was very tidy. Meals and clothes were formal. The women were house-proud. Gardens were fiercely controlled. For instance, flowers and shrubs were never allowed to grow in beds close to the house, let alone creepers up the walls. So we were able to regard this with the superiority of outsiders. Wynne described in more detail how the friendship progressed. We soon realised that we greatly enjoyed talking to each other. At first, this was mainly at lunchtime. Lunch was still a lengthy affair in Ulster, and most of the library girls who lived nearby went home to lunch. Philip and I didn't, and we took to walking down to a little cafe a short distance away and indulging in a bowl of soup, or in fine weather, walking in the nearby botanic gardens, described by Philip as, quote, 2 parallel walks of mist-loaded, flower-heaped, dew-drenched, autumnal beauty. Wynne also recalled familiar conversations with Larkin about life, love and marriage. Philip made it clear to me, she said, very soon, that he wished never to marry or have children. He had ideas which shocked me. I love nothing but deprivation and ignorance. People only have children so that they can be looked after in old age. These were sentiments I'd never heard before, and the result was that I mentally crossed him off my list of possible partners for life. Only when she'd left Belfast for a period, when her job came to an end, and she returned to England to study for a library qualification, did she realise that Larkin felt differently about things, that he was, if anything, infatuated with her, and his letters demonstrated that. They both shocked and surprised her with the level of emotional content expressed by Larkin. Larkin was instrumental in persuading his boss, Jack Granique, to re-employ her when another post came up a year later. However, this time, when she returned, she had become engaged, a situation which left Larkin distraught. Reflecting on this in later life, Winifred felt that her appeal to Larkin was somehow enhanced when she was no longer available to him. As usual with Philip, she wrote, once a woman had slipped from his grasp, he began to value her more, or perhaps he felt safe in knowing he would not be called upon to make any commitment. For whatever reason, our relationship became more intense in the last few months of our working life together. Now, this relationship was also important to Larkin in a creative sense. It led to him writing a total of 5 poems about her, more than any other woman in his life, before or after. The poem from which these lines are taken would become the first poem in The Less Deceived, lines from a young lady's photograph album. Winifred never liked it. It even led her to write an alternative version later on in life, which she called Photograph Album Revisited. In it, she documents a very different life for herself than that envisaged by Larkin. Winifred left Belfast for good in 1953, but her relationship with Larkin would continue throughout the rest of his life, in letters and in intermittent face-to-face meetings in England. Her papers are now deposited in the Hull History Centre, and the later letters show a renewed tenderness between them, particularly in later life. Wynne was to divorce her first husband, Jeff Bradshaw, and remarry, and she maintained her friendship with Philip Larkin right to the end of his days. What she didn't know during her time in Belfast, of course, was that Larkin was engaged in quite a different kind of relationship at the same time. In an article written after his death, she gave an account of him from what she called my particular compartment. She would not be the last to reflect on Larkin's highly compartmentalised life. In October 1951, Larkin moved into a new flatlet in Elmwood Avenue. It was part of a new development by the university to provide self-catering apartments for staff. The move to Elmwood Avenue was to have a profound effect on his life. Larkin outlined the process of moving in and settling down in great detail in the letters to his mother. He told her especially about the help being given by new friends, a married couple, both Oxford graduates, who'd come across from England. Colin Strang, an acquaintance Larkin had known at St John's, had taken up a post as a lecturer in economics at Queen's. His wife Patsy had studied medicine at Somerville College, Oxford, although she would never practice. Patsy was the daughter of wealthy parents living in South Africa, a father of Dutch descent and her mother Irish. The Strangs soon formed a close relationship with Philip. It's clear from his letters that he seemed excited by their cosmopolitan leanings and tastes. They're a pleasant, unassuming pair, he told his mother, and while they haven't any intellectual pretensions, they're streets ahead of the lumbering deadheads here. He fed his mother day-to-day details of the influence they were having on his social life. You'll be amused to hear that I bought 2 yards of white flannel, which Patsy cut into 2 and made 2 scarves of, 1 double and 1 single thickness. They look a bit odd, but I shall have them dyed different colours before wearing them. And then again, the Strangs came round, having promised to bring supper, but when they arrived they'd left it behind. I therefore had to produce ham and chicken in aspic, a tomato or 2 and some onions, which Patsy converted into a dubious fry. I'd done my party-coloured grapefruit as a sweet, and there was claret and stout for further orders, so it didn't do too badly. It's hard to put a finger on precisely when the affair began between Philip and Patsy, but there are quite a few hints in the letters home, to at least make his mother wonder. According to Richard Bradford, the Strangs' marriage was at the very least ajar, and things moved quickly. Andrew Motion described it as the most erotic of all his affairs. James Booth takes a different line and says that it was disastrous for Larkin and that Patsy alarmed him. Richard Bradford describes Patsy as the most overtly sexual woman Larkin would ever meet, and describes how they would book rooms in hotels under the name Mr. and Mrs. Crane, inspired of course by the dockside cranes alongside the Belfast lock. Patsy would roar with laughter as they departed, he tells us. Where he got this information from is unclear. In any case, none of this gives any credence to Patsy's own perspective, although we can glean from her correspondence with Larkin that they shared a close literary connection, and this was important in its own right, and possibly underplayed. Patsy Strang certainly had designs to be a writer herself. She lived in Paris and had a good understanding of and interest in French symbolism. Her letters to Larkin are full of literary commentary in which they discuss French poetry, cinema and the latest art exhibitions and so on. It suggested also that she influenced Larkin's poetry, perhaps in a less direct way from Winifred, but at least 2 poems are attributed to her by James Booth. In later life, Patsy Avis, as she became known, worked as a literary editor in Dublin and had 1 novel, Playing the Harlot, published posthumously, a novel in which Larkin features as the character Rollo. It's interesting to note some posthumous interest in her poetry too, particularly in Ireland. She was as clever as the clever men, Nuala O'Phelan asserted in her memoir Are You Somebody, where she criticised the perception of Patsy as a doomed soul, claiming that it was an argument often used to cover up indefensible circumstances. Like the other women in Larkin's life, Patsy Strang suffers from her own voice not being heard, it seems, and there's certainly more work that could be done on this. Larkin left Belfast for Hull in March 1955 to take up his post as head librarian at Hull University. He was to become the youngest head librarian in the country. It was a job he'd been encouraged to apply for by Jack Greenique, who appreciated his talents. And to some extent, Larkin left Belfast reluctantly. His return to England, of course, would take him back to closer proximity to Monica Jones and to a mother still unsettled and moving towards chronic depression. In both cases, each shared a hope that they might find their way up to Hull on a permanent basis. In a sense, Larkin had merely swapped one place that had been elsewhere for another, which was on the edge of things, and crucially, away from home. Here his poetry would continue to flow, for a time at least, and the legacy of Belfast would never be forgotten. As the poem Places Loved Ones shows, Belfast had brought him no closer to his proper ground, or to finding a special one with an instant claim to everything he owned, down to his name. Fundamentally, he remained that single person who'd stepped off the night boat 5 years before. And what about the women he'd encountered in Belfast? What happened to them? Patsy Strang ended her life tragically, dying at the age of 49 of a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. But there's a happier story to tell of Winifred. Her story would continue in a way that would have surprised and perhaps amused Larkin. She married twice. She settled in Winchester, a small distance away from Ruth Sivens, Larkin's first girlfriend and fiancée. She joined the Larkin Society once it was formed in 1997, and through that met and became friends with Maeve Brennan, another librarian who became part of Larkin's tangled web. Astonishingly, the three of them, Win, Maeve and Ruth, became very close friends for the rest of their lives, a particularly long time in the case of Win, who lived to be 85. The very first issue of About Larkin, the Philip Larkin Society's journal, although they called it a newsletter in those days, contained an article from Ruth on Larkin's time in Wellington and an interview between Maeve Brennan and Win. Among other things about her life in Belfast, Maeve asked her what he would have made of the friendship between the three of them. "I just don't know," Win said. "I think he would have been fascinated. Perhaps the fact that we all get on so well might be due to what a psychologist friend of mine tells me is assortative mating, the selection of a series of mates who have a strong resemblance to each other. Philip could not have envisaged our actually meeting and becoming friends." But in his centenary year, let me leave the last words with Philip Larkin himself, words he wrote to Judy Edgerton in 1967. "To the end of my days I shall thrill to the accent of that sharp skyline city where we met. It is quite magical. How I wish I'd done more there than amble about open-mouthed and drink English beer." Well, it's clear, I think, he did quite a bit more than that. Belfast was a very special place for Larkin.